This is just a quick recording. The reason why I'm bringing up this topic is because it's something that I see on a pretty regular basis, and it's something that I felt was definitely worth addressing. Now, unfortunately, you can't really see me that good. I'm driving right now. I hope that you can hear me pretty good, but I know you can't really see me that good, and I really won't be able to do any interaction because I'm driving. But I did feel it was something that definitely needed to be addressed. The thing about it is that when you are in a situation of debate, of argument, or when anybody, for that matter, is in a situation of debate or argument, then there is, if they are a skilled debater, then they will always use what sounds logical. They will use things that really make you think about their point. But regardless, anytime there is a debate or an argument, especially if one side is trying to put down or discredit the other side, then a debate is always biased. And no matter how logical you try to make it, there might not be a full picture being delivered. In other words, if I'm debating with an atheist, it's what that atheist is going to say to me is going to sound logical. It's going to sound good, and they're going to use all types of terminology about scientific terminology and so forth to make it sound logical. And for the sake of their argument, for the sake of a debater's argument, it does sound logical. It does sound logical. But when you only have part of the story, then then it makes it where you're unable to see past what has been presented. It makes it where you can't see past that logical sounding argument in order to see the bigger picture with a different perspective and greater truth. And that's where we in the church run into trouble so often. We run into trouble because we don't study to show ourselves approved. The word says to study to show yourself approved. And truth is, those who come against the church, who come against the Bible, who come against believers, know that very often the people that they are challenging have not taken the time to study to show themselves approved. They know this already. They know that the studying has not been done. And they play on that. But so that leads me to the discussion we're getting ready to have now, or that I'm about to talk about now, the topic. And that is bamboozled Christianity. The point that I'm discussing is that, if you look at social media, if you look at spends time on Facebook for any decent amount of time, you're going to see some post by somebody saying that Christianity is, you're going to hear something that says that Christianity is the white man's religion or the European's religion, and they tricked or bamboozled black people into following it during slavery. Some other variations to that will have people saying things like, they will say things such as, they will say stuff like, if it weren't for the slave master beating your ancestors, you would not know Christianity today. And they put like the different memes up where they show that this is how you found the Bible, this is how you found Christ, and so forth. And those arguments sound good. I mean, they sound legitimate when you start to think about, the history of the United States, transatlantic slave trade. It sounds legitimate. If you don't know the full picture, if you have not taken the time to study, it sounds legitimate, and it is very capable of throwing somebody off and making them question their position. It's a very effective tool. But if you have taken time to study and know the history, then you know the gaps and the problems with those arguments. And that's what I'm here for today. That's what I'm talking about today. So, and I'm sure that I have addressed this as well on the Facebook site. If you go to Facebook and look up UGFE Ministries, UGFE as in Universal God and Faith Equilibrium, then you will see some posts that I regularly place, and I start them off with the word dispelling memes, because a lot of times I would go and take those anti-Christianity, anti-Bible memes that float around, and then I will elaborate on them and address them from a standpoint of one who has studied the material and the history behind it and so forth. And so in regards to this idea that Christianity was the quote-unquote white man's religion, and that the only reason why black people or Africans knew about it, that's just not true. For lack of term, it's just not true. It often goes even further, whereas the critics of the religion will say that, will actually angle it to say that all of the plight that black people underwent, that Africans underwent in slavery, was all because of the Bible. And my first response to that is, well, that must be a pretty powerful Bible if it was able to control and dominate and conquer all of our ancestors. Well, let me go back to the first point, and then that will help to explain the second point. First point is this: the Bible did not reach Africa through Europeans. Europeans did not get the Bible until later. In the first century, the Bible was found still in the Middle East, in what we now know as the Middle East. Actually, back then, in the first century, especially in the BC time period, what we call the Middle East now, Israel, Palestine, all these places, that was still a part of Northern Africa. That was a part of Northern Africa. And it wasn't until later that the maps were redrawn by the Europeans to minimize Africa. Back in the BC times, Ethiopia covered like the top portion of Africa. It reached all the way from coast to coast and covered probably at least about a fourth of the continent. That whole area at the northern part of Africa was considered Ethiopia. And when Christianity first started, within that first century of Christianity, it was already making its way into Ethiopia. One of the oldest Bibles in existence right now is found in an Ethiopian church, and that was long before the transatlantic slave trade ever happened. In other words, the Bible, Scripture, was already in Africa as early as the first century. Because that's when it was first compiled. So as early as the first century, the transatlantic slave trade that everybody talks about and tries to use for their argument happened in about the 15th and 16th century. So that gives over 1,000 years, over 10 centuries, over 1,000 years before the slave trade ever happened, that it was over in Africa, undisturbed, when the Africans had access to it. Now, of course, once the Europeans stepped out and started doing their colonization and doing their conquests, then yes, they tried to use it under the guise of under the Trojan horse of spreading the word and spreading the gospel, but they manipulated it. At that point, this was a manipulated text by then. That's when before the Europeans stepped out, they did what's referred to as whitewashing. They took the images of those Middle Eastern, or aka Northern African images of Christ, of the different saints in the Bible, and they turned them all into white people, into Europeans. And that's why all of those paintings, the Leonardo da Vinci paintings and so forth, that are all over these great, huge places in Rome, all look the same. The blue-eyed people, the blonde hair, and so forth, because this was Leonardo painting the characters in his own image. So he made them to look like himself. Despite the fact that these were people from what we now know as the Middle East. Despite that, most of these characters, Christ actually spent time in Africa and was seen as the same. When he was a baby, he was hidden in Africa and so forth. I won't go into all of it, but he was hidden in Africa. Moses grew up in Africa, in Egypt. And back in these days, this also was before the Europeans started moving into those areas and intermixing with the Africans, lightening their skin tones. Which, if you go back in history, you'll read about that too. A lot of the places that we look around the world, from the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, all of these places, they were originally dark-skinned Africans. And then, as an act of Spain, for instance, in Puerto Rico, then Spain actually started sending their white citizens down to the Caribbean or to that area to begin mating with them in order to lighten up the people. Look it up. Research your history. But back to the other point about Christianity. Africans had the Bible. They had Christianity long before the transatlantic slave ever happened. Over 1,000 years. It wasn't until the 15th to 16th century that this happened. And honestly, to think that Africans were captured all because of just a Bible is kind of foolish. Have you not forgotten that these people, these European invaders, had guns? When they first came in, they weren't conquering with the Bible. They were conquering with force, with guns, with more advanced weaponry, and also manipulating other Africans to turn on each other. Once the slave trade happened, the Europeans would not even allow the black people, the Africans, to even read the Bible. Reading was prohibited. Learning the American language was prohibited. They would not even allow them to read the Bible. And then finally, a couple of the evil and corrupt colonists decided, okay, well, we can take this Bible and we can start using its content in order to manipulate them by manipulating what it originally said. And that's when they slowly start introducing it to the Africans without giving the Africans the ability to read it on their own. And of course, monitoring those so that things like Nat Turner rise-ups would not happen. Because once the Africans actually started reading the context of the Bible itself and seeing the stories about the people of Israel, the lowly enslaved and captured people of Israel standing up and fighting back, and not being and reading the scriptures about not being afraid of death, fearing no man, the Europeans could not accept that being something that they would be reading. So they would use these controlled sessions and teach them from the book that now the book is translated into their own language, because again, they already had it in Africa under their languages. But then when they converted it over to the English language, then now they start adding extra manipulation, extracting certain parts and only requiring certain servitude scriptures to be taught, but preventing the Africans from being able to read about conquering and fighting back and the war and the warfare that the people of Israel would fight against oppression. They prohibited that. That in itself is one of those considerations that says the Bible itself wasn't the evil thing. It was what the people were doing with it. They were manipulating. It's kind of like if you look at the rap industry today, and now people start saying, okay, Eminem is the greatest rapper, and they forego all of that other stuff, all of the other great rappers that were before then, and say, no, Eminem is the greatest rapper. and they do it in order to say, okay, the best of the best always comes from us. When in actuality, the whole history behind it, in itself, it was something that actually was created by black people and used by black people for the purpose of empowering their own people. But the same thing happened with the scripture. The scripture was manipulated, yes. And then they twisted it, they added stuff into it, took things out, and then presented this corrupted version in order to try to then add extra control over the Africans. But it wasn't. The Bible itself in the scripture part has no ability to control the people. The people were not held down and oppressed with the Bible. They were oppressed with whips and guns and weaponry and force. Yes, they tried to use the Bible as an antidote to further try to manipulate it, that manipulated version they tried to use, but that is not what conquered the people. What conquered the people were guns and advanced weaponry and just evil violence that they used against them. The same way when the Europeans went over to China and other places all around the world and conquered, they used force. They used force was their primary tool. But I said all that to say this. If you don't study your history, then yes, that would be a logical argument. Well, black people didn't get the Bible until slavery. It was forced upon them. But if you know your history, you know that's not true. But if you know your history, you know that the Bible was not actually presented, that the Bible was not, for one, when slavery first started, Africans were not even allowed to read the Bible. It was after the first couple 100 years, 1 to 200 years, that the Bible was even given or provided to the Africans anyway. The conquering did not happen from the Bible. They were prohibited from the Bible. The conquering happened by force. And as far as the original Bible, that was already in Africa long before, over 1,000 years before the transatlantic slave ever happened anyway. So don't be misled by that. Don't be misled by that, saints. Like I said, it sounds good, but it's just not accurate. Africans had the Bible first. Africans and Middle Easterners, which, well, we know now as Middle Easterners, as I said, but that originally was a part of Northern Africa. They had this Bible long before any type of slave trade, any type of European slave trade, transatlantic slave trade ever happened. They already knew it. It was already there. And some believers actually believe that foolishness too. There are some believers who will say, well, the great thing about slavery was that we were able to know the Lord. Wrong. Africans already had it before slavery. You didn't have to go through slavery in order to get the word. It was already there. It would have already it would have already made its way through you and made its way to you in Africa even without slavery. That's foolish talk. That's foolish talk. You did not have to be bamboozled with slavery and with all this negativity and hatred and abuse in order to receive the Bible. It was already there. And it was already spreading. And it was already in parts of Africa already. So ultimately, as the scripture says, in all you're getting, get understanding. That is one thing that is key. You must get understanding in everything that you are getting. You have to get understanding. Read Proverbs, read the word. You know, one element in the Bible is when it talks about the Bereans, and they were known for studying everything that was ever preached. They went back on their own and studied it, so that they would always know. And it's so important for us in the church today, and so neglected, unfortunately. Unfortunately, it's also very neglected, but it's so important for us in these days to make sure that we also have such a heart and passion for studying to show ourselves approved. Because that is the only way that we will ever be able to not be manipulated and not be thrown off and not have our faith hindered by the arguments of those who are against the faith. Those who argue will always make it sound logical, but it's going to be from a biased perspective, and it's going to be with limited information that's only limited to the scope of the argument that they are trying to drill in, the argument that they are trying to drive. But if you study, if you take that time to study to show yourself approved, then you will secure yourself from being manipulated and thrown off in that way. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this Periscope. I pray that this message has been a blessing. This one obviously was a lot less about preaching. It was a lot less about motivational. It was more about just straight up teaching. And I hope that you even take time to look it up yourself. take time to research that information yourself. Study to show yourself approved. And don't be bamboozled by those people who are trying to say that Christianity bamboozled you. So thanks again. Check me out online, ugfe.org. If you have prayer requests, want to send a donation, then you can do all of that from the site. So thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you next time.